Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the French MAS 44 semi-automatic infantry rifle. Now, as we've been doing for the last couple weeks, this is being filmed in conjunction with the Kickstarter pre-order launch of my book on French military rifles, Chassepot to FAMAS, French military rifles 1866 to 2016. So I have more information on this and the rifles that came before and after it both over in that book. So check that out. Link is in the description text below. But getting back to the MAS 44 here, of course the French did design and develop and produce and issue a semi-automatic rifle during World War I. It was the RSC 1917, and they made some 86,000 of them, so really a pretty substantial number. Although that was not intended really, well, they had ideas at the end of the war, but when it was being produced, that was not intended to be a universal rifle. What they came up with, like right after World War I, by 1921, they had a plan in place to pretty much renovate all of French military small arms. The very first step was to get rid of the 8mm Lebel cartridge and develop a modern straight wall rimless cartridge. And they got on that pretty quickly, but they also wanted to develop a semi-automatic standard infantry rifle. And so the cartridge was developed in 1924 and perfected by 1929, and throughout the 1920s, the various French arsenals did a lot of research and development on self-loading rifles. Probably the best place to find information on all of these weird prototypes is Jean Yuan's book, Proud Promise. But suffice to say, well, they had a major trial in 1931, and that's where everything kind of came together. Most of the domestic French companies like Hotchkiss and Darn didn't participate because they pretty much had their hands full building other stuff, and maybe they knew better than to try and get involved with the French army. The three French arsenals submitted designs. There were actually two rifles from MAS and one from MAT, Toul arsenal. And then there was also a Czech ZH-29 and a Swiss KE-9, both in the trials. Now, the result was no single rifle was deemed suitable, but they took elements of one of the MAS rifles and the MAT rifle and combined them together to form what they thought was the best hybrid. And that would eventually become the MAS 40. So it is a direct gas impingement rifle, a true one, unlike the AR-15. We'll touch on that in a moment. It uses a tilting bolt like the FAL and the Sturmgewehr would later on. And the hope was to get this thing into production. Well, the trial, they kind of picked the elements they wanted in the early 1930s. By the late 1930s, they finally had a really good prototype, the MAS 38/39, that had gone through endurance trials, reliability trials. It was really pretty excellent. By our standards today, the main downside of it was that it actually had a fixed magazine and only held 5 rounds fed by stripper clip. And this was based largely on the idea of wanting to have some compatibility between the semi-automatic rifle and the bolt-action rifle that the Army would both be using. The bolt-action, of course, would be the MAS 36. And so the idea of having basically the same style of magazine, and you can kind of understand the 5-round magazine as, if you look at this in terms of this French development program, was basically a post-World War I program that just stretched out into 20 years because of bureaucracy. By that standard, a 5-round fixed mag was understandable, although by the time they were actually testing this rifle, it was definitely behind the curve. At any rate, things continued to progress a little bit slowly until by the very late 1930s, it was pretty clear that war was coming. And the MAS 38/39 passed its tests in November of 1939, and it was ordered into immediate production in December of 39. The French government wanted 100,000 of them. They wanted to be delivered 1,000 a month, and this was completely impossible. They were going to be manufactured at the MAS factory, St Etienne. The problem was St Etienne was already manufacturing MAS 36 rifles as fast as it possibly could for exactly the same reason. And they just didn't really have any structural capacity to add another production line for another different rifle. So they started working on it. They finally got it set up to the point that they were going to be able to have rifle deliveries starting in mid-1941. Well, in 1941 is when France signed an armistice with Germany. And what's actually rather impressive about this is that the staff at St Etienne was able to effectively hide basically all evidence of this rifle from the Germans. So the Germans never realized that there was a semi-automatic rifle production program really on the cusp of beginning at St Etienne. what they apparently did is they were able to basically disguise the tooling for this rifle as MOS 36 tooling because the two guns share a lot of similarities. Anyway, when St Etienne was liberated in September of 1944, the program was able to get back on track. And that's when they decided to throw this thing into production. They could really use it. They wouldn't manage to actually get rifles produced before the end of World War II, but by late 1945, MOS 44 rifles were actually coming off the production line. Now, the one big change they made to these from the pre-war trials guns, basically, was to get rid of that fixed 5-round magazine. They realized during the war, look, wow, a 5-round stripper clip fed semi-auto rifle is way under capacity by modern standards. And so they retrofitted it with a 10-round detachable box magazine. And that explains one of the weird quirks of the whole MOS semi-auto series of rifles. That, of course, is the external magazine catch on the MOS box magazine. It's just about the only example out there of something like this, and it seems really weird until you realize that they already had the whole rifle designed with a fixed floor plate in here. And they wanted to get this thing into production as quickly as possible. So rather than redesign the whole receiver of the gun, they simply used a magazine that could fit basically into the receiver forging that they already had, cut a notch on the outside, and have the magazine lock on that way. Looking over the rest of the rifle, there are a lot of similarities with the MOS 36, and that was very deliberately done. So the stocks are very similar. The sling attachment, the butt plate, those parts are identical. The rear sight base is not identical, but the design is. This has the same style of rear aperture sight and the same style of leaf. So you'll notice that there is no adjustment on this. The way that you would zero these rifles was, well, it was an armor level task, and what you would do is actually get different rear leaf sights that had the aperture offset up, down, left, or right in increments of like 4 centimeters at 100 meters. And so the armorer would simply shoot the rifle on a bullseye, determine exactly where the group was actually landing, and then choose the appropriate rear sight leaf to bring that group into the center of the target. The nose cap and the front end of the rifle is also virtually identical to a MOS 36, specifically the stamped design of 36 that was introduced just after World War II. These are simplified and economized versions of the pre-war MOS 36 parts. The bayonet here is also literally identical to the MOS 36. It is a spike style of bayonet that is housed directly under the barrel. And to install it, you simply flip it around and lock it in place like so. While French bolt-action rifles traditionally never had manual safeties, the semi-automatic ones did. The RSCs had safeties on them, and the requirements for the MOS 40/44 semi-automatic rifle required a safety that was obvious, that when engaged was obvious to the shooter. And so they have a very simple lever here, and when it's dropped down, it's on safe, and of course it gets in the way of your trigger finger and makes it pretty clear that the safety's engaged, at least if you're right-handed. We have one main set of markings on here that identify this as a MOS, model of 1944, with a serial number. These serial numbers will all have script letter prefixes, and for the MOS 44, they're all F prefix. That was the first letter assigned to the St Etienne arsenal, and of course, they only made 6,200 of them, so they never got to a second prefix. That would have been it after they passed 100,000. That said, there is really only one variation within the MOS 44, and that is the finish. So very early on, the rifles were parkerized and then painted with a black lacquer paint, and you'll see that fairly typically on a lot of 1930s French military rifles. So this is serial number 221 right at the very beginning, and it's still got a really nice exemplary coat of this black enamel paint. That was done on there simply to give the rifles more resistance to really nasty environmental conditions like you might find in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They stopped using that black enamel paint somewhere around serial number 2000. So this one is late enough that it is just a parkerized finish. One element that I think is often not recognized is just how simple and durable and reliable the MOS semi-automatic rifles really are. And they all have fundamentally the same operating system. So we'll go ahead and take apart this Model 44. You start by pulling down this latch back here, you can then push the receiver top cover forward, unlock it, lift it up, and take it off the back. So we'll do that. We do have a recoil spring, there we go, that is wound up inside there. So take that off. This has our recoil spring guide and the rear sight. I can then pull out the recoil spring. I can then take the bolt carrier, pull the bolt carrier back, lift it up and out, and I can take out the bolt itself and the firing pin. And that's it for field stripping the rifle. The way the gas system works is that there is simply a gas port in the barrel out here. I'm not going to take the handguards off because this is really a pain in the butt. The French soldier was not intended to remove the handguards, and so it affects the rifle's accuracy if they're not retightened just the same and requires a special screwdriver to get them off. But what you effectively have is just a gas port and a gas tube that runs under the handguard to right here, where the gas tube just simply ends. And when the rifle's in battery, the bolt carrier has a hole in it right here that nests over the end of that gas tube, like so. And when you fire, gas simply blows out this tube into this hollow, basically this dead-end hollow section in the bolt carrier, and throws it backward, cycling the rifle. So where the AR-15 has a long gas tube like this that ends in a sealed gas piston, a true gas impingement design, like the MOS 40/44 here, doesn't have a piston. It's just a hollow space that gas blows into to push the carrier back. The one other element of disassembly that we can do is to take out the trigger assembly. So we have a little flat spring here that acts as a lock on the trigger spring. But if I take this screw out, there we go, then the trigger group simply lifts out as an integral unit. And aside from being full of gloopy cosmoline, it's an extremely simple one. So we have our safety lever here, and then this is, of course, a hammer-fired system. So when I pull the trigger, that hammer is going to go forward, just like so. We've got a wound-up spring in here. We've got two catches, two sears back there, so that whether you're holding the trigger back or not, it will catch when the hammer recocks, and pull the trigger again for a second shot. These were always only semi-automatic rifles, while a lot of other countries experimented with select fire 308 caliber rifles like the FAL and the G3 and the US M14. The French just, I guess, kind of recognized actually that full auto fire from the shoulder in a rifle like this, in a caliber like this, and by the way, this is in 7.5 by 54 millimeter French. It is very similar to 7.62 NATO, but a slightly lighter bullet and a just slightly reduced muzzle velocity. Full auto fire of that from the shoulder was useless, and they never bothered to develop a select fire trigger assembly for the guns. There are some stories of armors in the field converting them ad hoc, but that's I think a pretty limited thing. At any rate, the trigger mechanism on this is extremely simple, which is not surprising. If you look at the trigger mechanism on the RSC 1917 semi-auto rifle, it's very similar, also very simple, and there was no reason to make it more complicated than this. As for the locking system, what we have here is a tilting bolt. So this is the locked position with your locking surface right here on the back. That's locked, that's unlocked, lifted up. This oval piece on the outside of the receiver is basically, this is the block that holds the locking shoulder in the rifle. So this guy right here is your specially made and specially hardened locking shoulder, and that's the surface that this locks up against. So here you have it on the other side, and this is a replaceable part. So if there's a problem with the locking shoulder, or if a gun gets out of headspace for some reason, that locking shoulder can be replaced without having to replace the rest of the rifle. The MOS 44 had a spring-loaded firing pin, as you can see there, and the whole system, the whole series, the whole family of these rifles has a nice out-of-battery safety, namely that the rear of the bolt carrier here holds onto the firing pin. So the firing pin cannot physically go forward far enough to protrude out the bolt face unless the bolt is all the way back and locked. So even there, until it's all the way back to there, like so, the firing pin just isn't long enough to reach the breech face, and thus it can't fire out of battery. Once it is fully locked, then you have that much travel for when it gets hit by the hammer. We can take this apart very easily. You just lift the bolt carrier off the back. There's our firing pin. We have a spring inside there. This is a bit unique to the MAS 44. They would actually get rid of this spring in later iterations, but we'll cover those in separate videos. You can see that the bolt carrier and the bolt here are both actually electro-penciled with their matching serial numbers. The ejector is this plug sticking out the front of the bolt face. That's pushed back in flush when a cartridge is on the bolt. And then when the bolt carrier goes backward, this lug hits another element in the receiver and pushes forward, and that acts as an ejector, kicking the case off of the bolt face. And then there's not really anything going on here on the bolt carrier. We just have this big nylon handle. Be aware, especially on the 44s, these nylon handles, or plastic, I think they're nylon, are pretty old, and a lot of them have gotten pretty brittle, and they do have a tendency to break, especially if you shoot them. So something to be aware of. It's not uncommon to find them in a condition like this, unfortunately. In total, they would produce 6,200 of these MAS 44s, and the majority of them went to French Navy Marine commandos in Indochina, and the guns did see substantial combat service down there. However, it wouldn't take that long before they started to realize that there were some flaws, and this would lead to the development of the MAS 49 rifle. Now, the MAS 49 is the subject for our next video. There are a couple different iterations of that we need to look at, and this video has gone too long as it is. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. This is one of the lesser known of the series of French semi-auto rifles, and one of the other interesting elements to it is the vast majority of these guns, when they were declared obsolete and surplused by the French military, virtually all of them were purchased by an American company, and they were brought here to the US. And so these rifles are actually, compared to the MAS 49s, these are relatively common here in the US, and I think a lot of people don't realize just how rare they actually are in a grand scale. These are very difficult to find anywhere else in the world except here, and a lot of people here, I think, don't realize quite how special they are in terms of their developmental sequence. So anyway, if you're interested in them, hopefully you have a little bit more information to work with now. And of course, as I said at the beginning, this is being filmed in conjunction with the launch of my book on French military rifles, which goes into more depth on this entire story, along with the MAS 49 and the 4956, and of course all of the rifles that came before, like the RSC semi-autos. So if you're interested in the subject, if you're interested in French military developments or just small arms development in general, definitely head over to Kickstarter and pre-order a copy of it. You can find the link to that down in the description text. Thanks for watching.